Good evening and welcome to the 10th episode of Arab Identity. Today we will be talking about the revolt of 1920 and the creation of the Iraqi state. The rebellion of 1920 is a seminal event in Iraqi history and is one of the few founding stories about which most of Iraq's population can agree. At its height, the rebellion, a mix of armed tribal uprisings and civil disobedience in towns, covered large parts of the mid-Euphrates Valley, the shrine towns, and Baghdad. It required large military and financial commitments by the British to put it down. A great deal has been written on the rebellion by both Iraqi and non-Iraqi writers and historians. It played a major part in the elevation of King Faisal to the Iraqi throne. It changed the balance of power inside the country. It shifted British policy towards indirect rule, and it created a powerful narrative of resistance and struggle that was exploited by subsequent oppositionists and radical nationalists. I will not dwell into the subject of the 1920 revolt, and I leave you to refer back to history references for it. I want to spend more time today with our honorable guest discussing some of the thoughts, reflections of the 1920 revolt and its subsequent effect on the formation of Iraq and on the Arab psyche and Arab identity till our day today. What I want to read a little excerpt, although nevertheless, from George Antonius' The Arab Awakening, to have the bigger picture of the 1920 revolt in perspective. What with the decisions of San Remo Conference, of course, the 1920 revolt happened after the San Remo Conference that took place in April 25, 1920, and it was declared or made public in May 5, 1920. The decisions of the San Remo Conference, the occupation of the whole Syria by the French, the consolidation of British control in Iraq on a basis which denied even the outward forms of self-government, and the emergence of a policy of intensive Zionist development in Palestine that year, 1920, has an evil name in Arab annals. It is referred to as the year of catastrophe, عام النكبة. نعم, 1920 was the first al-Nakba, a year for the Arabs. It saw the first armed risings that occurred in protest against the post-war settlement imposed by the Allies on the Arab countries. In that year, serious outbreaks took place in Syria, Palestine, and Iraq. There came a time when practically the whole of the Arab rectangle was seething with discontent expressing itself in acts of violence. The first of those outbreaks occurred in Palestine at Easter. In Syria, the occasional clashes which had taken place in the first half of the year were followed, after the entry of the French into Damascus and the fall of the Arab state, by a series of organized attacks in different parts of the country. In the region between Aleppo and Antioch, a group of leaders succeeded in raising a considerable body of volunteers and fought several engagements with French columns sent out against them. The insurgent forces could not get the better of the large reinforcements which the French had brought into the country and were mastered almost everywhere before the year was out. But their failure, far from reconciling the population to its lot, made the French mandate appear still more hateful and served to increase the disaffection and strengthen the spirit of resistance. By far the most serious rising occurred in Iraq. Throughout the spring, the discontent against the regime of direct British rule had found its expression in a movement of spontaneous agitation. It was not an anti-British movement in the sense that it was inspired by mere hostility to Great Britain, but its insurgence against the denial of independence and the arbitrary imposition of the mandatory system. Instead of enjoying Arab rule with a measure of British assistance, the people found themselves subjected to British rule with nominal Arab assistance. It added to the intensity of the agitation that it was furthered and encouraged by Iraqi leaders in Damascus, and more particularly by Iraqi branch of Al-Ahad, the pre-war secret society of Arab officers in the Ottoman army, most of whom had served in the revolt. The agitation had been met by ill-advised measures of repression carried out with single-minded severity and determination by Colonel A.T. Wilson, the acting civil commissioner, who, in his fervent belief in the virtues of good government, remained impervious to the manifestation of the Arab fervor for self-governance. Wholesale arrests of leaders, accompanied by acts of summary punishment and deportation, took place, which, as they did not remove the real causes of the discontent, served mainly to inflame it. The announcement of the San Remo decisions came as the crowning provocation, and from that moment the feeling hardened into the determination to revolt. The Committee of Al-Ahd issued a proclamation denouncing the decisions and calling upon the people of Iraq to resist the dictation of the Allied powers by force. On the 17th of June, it was announced that the British government had authorized the calling of a general elective assembly for the purpose of drawing up an organic law for Iraq. But the announcement had come too late to have a pacifying effect, and in any case it left the San Remo decisions as they stood. Towards the end of June, an incident brought matters to a head, and the tribes of the Middle Euphrates rose. The story of the rebellion has often been told, but perhaps the most reliable account is to be found in a recent work of outstanding scholarly merit. It's a distressing tale of warfare between friends, of which the horror is exceeding only by the folly which brought it about. It lasted from July to October, at the end of which the toll of losses had risen to some 10,000 casualties. The number of Arabs killed is not known with any certainty. It may have been as high as 4,000. Over 400 British lives were lost, apart from 1,800 other casualties. The cost to the British was over £40 million, which was more than 3 times the total amount of the subsidies paid by Great Britain in gold, arms, and supplies for the furtherance of the Arab revolt from the beginning to the end, which is very ironic. The damage to property and to the sources of revenue in the country was immense. What added to the gravity of the rebellion was that it took on the character of a religious crusade. At first, during the greater part of July, it had been directed mainly by tribal chiefs and by ex-officers of the Arab revolt. As the weeks went by and the rebels gained ground, the religious leaders of the Shia joined the movement openly in the hope of giving it the intensity of a holy war. By the end of July, when news had come of the French occupation of Damascus, the leaders of the insurgents felt that the moment had come for a supreme effort. It took the form of a general call to jihad, which was first proclaimed early in August in Najaf and Karbala, the two holiest cities of the Shia in Iraq, and later throughout the whole countryside of the Middle and Lower Euphrates. I will stop at that moment of narrating history. This is according to George Antonius, The Arab Awakening, one of the most important resources for the early Arab history. And I will introduce my honorable guest, Dr. Abbas Kadhim, who is a resident senior fellow and director of the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. His research interests focus on Iraq, Iran, Persian Gulf, and Islam. Dr. Kadhim earned his Ph.D. in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California, Berkeley in 2006. Between 2005 and 2013, he was an assistant professor of national security, Middle East Studies at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and a visiting scholar at Stanford University. Dr. Kadhim has more than 15 years of experience advising various U.S. government officials and personnel, executive and legislative. He is the author of Reclaiming Iraq, the 1920 Revolution, and the Founding of the Modern State, published by University of Texas Press, and The Hawza and Their Siege, a study in the Ba'ath Party archives, Boston University Press. Welcome, Dr. Kadhim, in the Arab Identity series.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, for also conducting this series of works which are important and timely. We all are thinking and reflecting on Arab identity, how it started, where it is now, and this is a debate that is great to have. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Doctor. The 1920 revolts. Do you consider it a part of the Greater Arab Revolt that was taking place at that time as a continuation of the Great Arab Revolt, or is it more of an Iraqi identity?
Great question. In the book, I do speak about the historic and geographical, the geopolitical context of the revolution. I incidentally call it a revolution, a revolt. This was something that I spent some pages in the book talking about why it is a revolution, and we call it a revolution. It has been called many things: revolt, rebellion, insurrection, many ways of terminologies were used. Given the studying its consequences, its preludes, the way it went, I do consider it a revolution. So this is kind of part of what I argued in the book. Now, back to your question, there was a context. There was the 1919 revolution or the revolt in Egypt, which is important. There was also the Arab Revolt, which started within the context of the World War I, where Sharif Hussein bin Ali, with his sons Faisal and Abdullah mainly, worked with the British and advanced towards from Mecca towards the Levant, and ended up occupying or liberating, name it how you like, the whole Levant, that is Jordan, Palestine, Syria, and at the time Syria, Lebanon, of course. So all of the Levant, and then that ended up with the setup of a short-lived monarchy led by Faisal. So there was also a number of revolts and revolutions in the larger geographic neighborhood. There was, of course, the Bolshevik revolution, which is of 1917, and it was a time of revolt, whether it is against domestic forces and political regimes or against colonization and colonizers. However, that said, there is the inspiration side of it, but also we must not discount the fact that the Iraqis were reaching a point where they had no hope of seeing the British promises, especially the Mode Declaration that was distributed in Baghdad in 1917, promised the Iraqis self-rule and independence, and by which the British said they came liberators, not conquerors. And with time, the British were looking more and more like conquerors and colonizers, and that instigated or provoked Iraqis into a revolt. So while there were external inspirations, the motives and the process of the revolution was domestic, and it was all about the grievances of Iraqis, particularly in the Middle Euphrates, and where the revolution started and when it ended as well, and there were some extensions during the course of the revolution we could talk about, where it expanded geographically outside the Middle Euphrates. By the Middle Euphrates, we are talking about, in today's world, Najaf, Hilla, Diwaniyah, Samawa, and that Karbala, that particular neighborhood. It did expand up north to Diyala, and also down in the south to the Khar province, but in a limited way.
Thank you, Doctor. Before we continue, I want to go back to the point of revolt versus revolution. Please tell us, why should we call it a revolution versus revolt? Always, I keep in mind in this series a younger generation of Arab Americans who want to learn about their identity and history. So we are trying to provide them with context of their history and identity. And if they search for this subject, they mostly will see sources with calling it Iraqi Revolt. Please let us know, why should we call it revolution, and refrain from calling it a revolt?
Well, mostly it is in the English usage of the term. There in the literature of revolutions, there are textbook examples of revolutions. Normally, that the ones that are cited, that's the ruler. Everything is measured against the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution. Later on, Tada Scotchball, who is a top scholar of this kind of literature, she added the Iranian Revolution to that. So these are considered to be a revolution. A revolution in that context, it means that it will change the social, the economic, and the political setting of the place. There would be a different outcome or a different nature of a state after the revolution from what was prior to the revolution. Again, economically, politically, socially, and normally it takes time. It can span into a decade or more for all of these changes to take place. So that's the classical sense of what revolutions are. However, there have been literature, including Scotchball, does talk about other revolutions that are political revolutions, not necessarily revolutions that change a regime or that change the entire face of a nation, but they do represent milestones in the history of the countries wherein they occur. And while the Iraqi revolution of 1920 did not change the regime, the British remained in power. The revolution ultimately lost in the short term, but it did change many things. It changed Iraq from a colony that belonged to the British. The original plan of the British was to annex parts of Iraq in the south to the India office, and then keep Baghdad as a kingdom or a sheikhdom that is governed by an Arab under British auspices, and then Mosul was to be negotiated, maybe to be returned to the Ottomans. These were the original 3 Iraqi vilayets under the Ottomans. The revolution forced the creation of the nation of Iraq as we know it. Iraq is the result of that revolution. That was the deal that Sir Percy Cox made in London while he traveled to London while the revolution was going on. And then the British press and British population and the government were split between those who would call for cut and run and leave Iraq to its devices, and those who said to stay in the same course of the military colonization. Both solutions were untenable. So he ultimately offered a compromise, which was to go back and create a national Iraqi government and create a state according to the San Remo mandates. So that was part of this. Also, we started seeing a different social conditions were happening in Iraq. We saw a lot of change, in fact, mostly political, but also in the face of the society. Iraq, that has not been governed by an Arab since 1258, the Mongol invasion. It continued from one foreign rule to another foreign rule until the Ottomans that controlled Iraq from 1638 all the way to 1918. And then after that, a British rule for a couple of years. We started seeing an Arab rule in Iraq, a nation that was one of the earliest nations in the region that joined the League of Nations, and it became a true country, a monarchy. And in fact, the Iraq from 1921 until of course, the independence was gained in 1932 and Iraq joined the League of Nations. But from 1921 all the way to 1958, the monarchy was, in fact, presiding over a country or a state that was one of the strongest in the Middle East. So this revolution did cause real changes that you would see in all classical revolutions, and they're not in the immediate aftermath, but in the long-term consequences.
Thank you. Quoting Dr. Ali Allawi, Faisal I of Iraq says, the uprising was the final nail in the coffin of the policy that sought to turn Iraq into a protectorate directly ruled by Britain. Whitehall has now completely won over the idea of an Arab government run by locally recruited civil servants, albeit advised by the British. Britain's influence would now be indirect and elusive, exercised subtly through a high commissioner. Iraq would be bound by the terms of the mandate, but the illusion and part substance of independence would be maintained without serious jeopardy to the to Britain's interest. So it definitely has changed the direction of Iraq and led to bringing in the King Faisal, who has he's one of the factors of the success of the establishment of the state of Iraq. Would you consider King Faisal as a stabilizing fact and one of the factors that actually allowed Iraq to be one of the earliest Arab states?
Well, Faisal is an important figure in Iraqi history. There is no question about it. He is not the founding father of the modern Iraq. He traveled to Iraq when it was already a state. There was a government, and the only reason why Faisal was selected to rule over Iraq, and he was one of a few names that were candidates for this, is because Iraqis could not agree. And this is, every time you see Iraq, this is the same story even today. Iraqis could not agree on one personality that would be the king of Iraq. And the founding fathers of the Iraqi state, those who participated in the 1920 revolution, those who also were leading figures in their respective societies inside Iraq at the time, did not trust one another, did not like one another very much. And only they worked together and impressively during the revolution is because they had a common enemy. But once that enemy was no longer in presence, once there was a situation to or the conditions to form a government, they turned against each other and they began to act in a hostile, mutually hostile way. And that's why the British, giving up on the possibility of having an Iraqi to lead Iraq, they decided to scout for other people in the region. Now the Iraqis, and this is part of, really fits into the theme of what you are working on here, which is Arab identities. The Iraqis weren't much interested in having an Iraqi to be the king or to be the leader. They wanted an Arab. That was in all of their responses and in all their demands to the British from the early days of the occupation and throughout the revolution and in the post or during the revolution time as well. They didn't mind any Arab that they could trust and they could respect would be the king of Iraq. Initially, they were more interested in having King Abdullah, brother of Faisal, who is the grandfather of the current king of Jordan. And because Abdullah was already the king of Jordan and could not be given both Jordan and Iraq, he was the one, Faisal was the only son of Sharif Hussein, who was without a kingdom, and he was ready to be the king of Iraq. At the time, the leaders of the 1920 revolution were guests of Sharif Hussein. They fled from Iraq after the failing of the revolution. And at that, in those meetings that they had with Sharif Hussein, they agreed with him that he would allow Faisal to go to Iraq and be the king. with conditions that he would ask the British for a completely independent state ruled by a constitution and a monarch. But Faisal, of course, was given half of that. He was given an independent Arab state, but under a British mandate, and that kind of split the Iraqi leaders. Some of them supported Faisal, some of them did not support him in the beginning, but at least they didn't veto his coronation. Ultimately, Faisal was brought to Iraq, and he was embraced by Iraqis, especially in the Middle Euphrates and in the south of Iraq. But ultimately, he made himself a convincing leader of the country, even though he failed to create the state that he would have envisioned. He wrote a memo just before his death. He laments the fact that the Iraq that he was a monarch of did not have Iraqis in the sense. So there was an Iraq, but no Iraqis. He found the population to be lacking the common identity, Iraqiness, if you will. But ultimately, one would argue that his work was important. He saw the monarchy from the early days of the mandate, where a few people who were mostly from one community, these Iraqi Sunnis, who were mostly either officers or officials in the Ottoman Empire at the time, were gathered, and they were given the responsibility to learn and to be the future leaders of the country. And the British did a good job, a very decent job, in fact, in training those Iraqis and turning them from either military professionals or low-level clerics, low-level
administrators,
bureaucrats, and made them into ministers and into high-level officials. And in about 11 years or 12 years, Iraq was able to stand on its own feet as a fully self-governed nation. And from that experience, the mandate of the British, we had very impressive statesmen in Iraq, people like Noor al-Said, people like Yassin al-Hashimi, Jamil al-Madfa'i, many others who ended up leading the country. And also, during that time, they cultivated a new generation of Iraqis, where they were sent to mostly abroad to study and come back with high degrees. People like Muhammad Fadl al-Jamali, Matti Aqrawi, etc. These are the guys who became the ministers and prime ministers in the 1940s and 50s. So it was, in essence, I think, Faisal's work and Faisal's role, as much as one can really find many faults and shortcomings in his style and pragmatism, but one cannot deny his role. And I think Professor Ali Allawi's book is an excellent and fair treatment of Faisal's role and position in Iraqi history.
Definitely, yeah. This book is a very fair testimony and reading of King Faisal. And I agree with you, Doctor. I think I cannot imagine, given the challenges and obstacles that Faisal had to deal with, I cannot imagine doing a better job than what he did in establishing what he could establish. But there is a point here before we go back to the revolution, because there's a lot of elements that we would like to discuss in the revolution. This is a very important, يعني مشهد, very important scene of Arab identity, when Iraqis have accepted Faisal and called for Faisal to become their leader. And Faisal is from Mecca. He's from Hijaz. This has never been an issue at that time, as you know that Al-Arabi al-Fatat, from which Abdullah and Faisal belong. It was a mix of Arab from all different localities. They established the first Arab conference in the Congress in Paris in 1913, from all different nationalities, calling upon Arab from all different places, even from the diaspora. And when they established their revolution, the revolution was also pretty much mixed between different all the different Arabs. And then when the government in Damascus was established, there were a lot of Iraqi officers and Iraqi personnel. And then when Faisal moved to Baghdad, he also brought with him many of the Al-Fatat members and Al-Ahd members, and Ja'far al-Askari was appointed minister, and Rustum Haidar was appointed minister. He's from Lebanon. He was appointed minister of finance, I think. There is what's his name? There was a Jewish minister also, Sassoon Effendi.
Pascal Sassoon.
Naam, he was also one of the ministers. So the Arab identity was the one that people identified with. Religious ones and different, regional ones were kind of secondary, and was not a priority. Was not seen as the foremost identity, and that's something embedded in the Arab identity, even the modern identity, and that is why. Is there any interference in the sound, Doctor?
No, that's fine.
Okay, so and that's why there was a lot of disappointments out of which these sort of revolts came about after San Remo, is because Arabs wanted to be united and independent, and they didn't have both. After San Remo, it confirmed their divisions against their will, and it confirmed they're also being mandated by these colonialist powers, which was disappointing. And the disappointment became despair, and the despair turned into anger, and this anger expressed itself in revolution. Going back to the revolution, Doctor, though, I want to bring about a very important element of the 1920 revolution, is the role of the Shia and the Hawza in this revolution. They took leadership in this revolution, and that role has always been celebrated by Shia as a very patriotic and Arabic role. Do you want to talk a little bit about this? How did a country that has been not ruled by an Arab for a very long time maintain such a strong identity, and the religious fervor was aligned with the Arabic identity and Arabic purpose?
Well, this is a great question. The Middle Euphrates at the time, of course, the British went to Iraq and occupied territory. So there were 3 vilayats, and
Doctor, I can't hear you. Doctor, I can't hear you for some reason. I think. For some reason, I can't hear you. Can you hear me? Yeah, I can't hear you. I'm not sure if the audience can hear us. I still can't hear you. Would you like to restart your computer? We'll try that. And okay, yeah, the audience just confirmed that they can only hear me. So if you can do us a favor, doctor, and just restart your computer, and we will continue from there. So thank you, whoever is following this episode and listening to the recording later. This is a very important chapter in the Arab history. That year, 1920, was the year of Nakba, where Arabs. It was confirmed that Sykes-Picot is going to take place. Sykes-Picot, which took place secretly in 1916. It was revealed by the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, but the news didn't really come till 1918. By that time, Arabs were already in Damascus. And when they established their state and raised the Arab flag over, which is right behind me, this Arab flag, they raised it over Damascus, and they raised it over Beirut, and they raised it over everywhere. After all the sacrifices that they have done, allied to the British in freeing the Arab world from the Turkish rule, they were all of a sudden shocked with a betrayal, a clear betrayal of the British and the French, especially the British, who gave the promises, and they gave promises for several people at the same time. And they basically had to face that. So they faced it in Syria in a form of what has become an armed struggle, manifested itself in the Battle of Maysalun in July 25 of 1920, where Yusuf al-Azama, the Minister of Defense that was appointed by the first Arab Congress, really, the Syrian Congress, he was killed in that battle. That battle, of course, they had not enough even bullets to face the French tanks. But that reverberated all over the Arab world. So there was a revolt in Egypt, and there was a revolt in Iraq against the colonialism. And it in Iraq, it was one of the strongest revolts. It costed the British the most damage, and it really created the concessions that came about of the establishment of the state of Iraq, which then helped the establishment of the rest of the Arab states. Are you with us, Dr. Abbas? Can you hear me?
I am with you. Do you hear me?
I hear you very well. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
So let's pick the question where we last one.
Yes, the role of Shia in the 1920 revolt, and the manifestations that come out of that.
All right. Yes. As I mentioned, and I don't know how much you heard of that. Let me start it from the beginning to keep the trail of thought. Iraq was not alien to the Arab identity and Arabness. Let's remember that Baghdad was the capital of the Muslim Arab Empire from 750 AD to 1258. And everything in the Arabic tradition, Arabic civilization, if we can call it that way, is somehow associated with Baghdad. Iraqis gave to the Arab civilization some of its most important poets, some of its most important theologians, jurists, historians, you name it. I mean, Baghdad is the epicenter of Arab civilization, and it continued. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, early 1900s, Baghdad was not as it wasn't the center of culture and of Arabic sciences it used to be. The literacy in Baghdad was very low when the Ottomans left and the British arrived. There was a state of disaster, if you will, in the general education and general culture in Baghdad. It was Ottomanized. It was neglected. It was bruised, if you will, badly bruised culturally and historically. However, the Middle Euphrates continued to be a very important center of learning because of the Hawza, the religious seminary that was continuously operating away from state auspices and state influence from 1055 AD throughout until today, actually. So it never stopped. And advanced Arabic was taught, advanced religious sciences, advanced cultural works. If you look at the level of poetry and level of writing in prose that was produced in Najaf and in Karbala at the turn of the century, some of the most important literature that we still have and study and teach is from that era. So it was, in fact, a center of Arabic culture and Arabic learning. Also, Najaf was not an oasis, or it was not an isolated island. Najafis were receiving newspapers that would come to them from, and I write about that in the book, from Syria, from Damascus, also from Egypt, from Cairo. And there was that cultural exchange that was happening. And that's what kept the Iraqis, and also they would send what they produce in Najaf and in Karbala. So there was actually a very large pile of knowledge and of culture and of literature that was fueling the identity of the people. That's why they found themselves to be Arabs first and foremost. In all their demands, they were emphasizing their Arabness as an identity and also as a political orientation. And that's why it didn't come as a surprise or as an anomaly that you would see the revolution, the 1920 revolution, to be mostly an Arab revolt expressing Arab demands. Now, where does the Hawza fit into that? Of course, the Hawza not only being the cultural leaders and also the leaders of, or the social leaders. There were two leaderships going on in the region, in the Middle Euphrates. Most of the Middle Euphrates was a tribal area, so every tribe had its own sheikh, and that tribal chief is the one that holds the authority over his respective tribe. But also the role of the religious ulama, especially the marja'iyya, the highest scholarly figures in Najaf and in Karbala at the time. They were the natural leaders of and the spiritual leaders of the community over there, and not only respected and followed by their Shia followers, but also their authority extended to Iraqi non-Shia population. And we saw there is a mutual understanding between the leaders of the Sunni community and even the Christian community with the leaders in the Middle Euphrates. So you could not really have a revolt or even any social movement without having the Shia clergy at the heart of it. Because they are not just religious scholars. If you see the profile of each one of them, take Muhammad Sa'id al-Haboubi or Muhammad Taqi al-Shirazi, or even people like Muhsin al-Hakim, who was young at the time. They were all poets, they were writers, they were social leaders, and or in addition to their main vocation and main specialty, which is being religious leaders and theologians.
The 1920 revolution proves that the Hawza of Najaf and the Hawza of Karbala are a very strong part of the Arab world, and the Arab struggle and the Arab united aspirations and united spirit. Do you feel, Doctor, that sometimes this is a question today, that this loyalty of the Hawza to the Arab cause has been questioned lately because of political reasons?
Well, they did not view themselves as local leaders. The Hawza and the Marja'iyya, the highest scholars in Najaf or in Karbala, I mean, it moved in the late 1800s. It started in Samarra with Mirzat Hassan Shirazi. Then it moved to Najaf. And then it moved later on to Karbala during the 1920 revolution, and then returned to Najaf after that. But those Shia religious leaders, first they are by their own role, they are leaders of the Shia communities anywhere there you find the Shia, from Pakistan to Afghanistan to Iran to the Gulf region in Arab Gulf states and Lebanon and Iraq. I mean, yes, you have figures in those countries. Sometimes they are, grand ayatollahs, no less than the ones residing in Najaf. But generally, people in all of these countries view or look to Karbala and Najaf because of the spiritual place and also the historic significance of the Hawza of Najaf and the Hawza of Karbala and the shrines, the imams of the Shia who are buried there. But also, I would mention that these leaders did not concern themselves with only what goes on in the Shia communities in the world, not just in Iraq, but also were interested in the affairs of all Muslims because they saw themselves as Muslim leaders as well. So you started, you see reactions, for example, from the Hawza about the Italian invasion of Libya. You see them talking about the French colonization in Algeria and in other places, and you see them conducting or holding poetry festivals and conferences and organizing fundraisings for those. Same thing with Sharia. Same thing. You see them interested in whatever happens in the Muslim world. And sometimes they do organize more than just issuing fatwas, but as I said, they organize fundraisings. They even encourage people to fight against aggressors, against Muslim communities, not just in the Shia communities, but also beyond the Shia communities. And this is not new. I mean, you see them today as well. I mean, Sistani, Grand Ayatollah Sistani, does talk about Palestine, and the Palestinians does talk about people in all areas in Afghanistan and wherever there is a situation where Muslims are in distress. He doesn't look at this narrow sectarian identity of those Muslims, but he really is interested. And sometimes even they go beyond that, where they comment on issues that on a human basis rather than even religious basis.
Thank you, Doctor. And the position of the Shia in Lebanon was similar too, through Sayyid Abdul Hussein Sharafuddin and Sayyid Mohsen al-Hakim and Sayyid Abdul Hussein Nuruddin, who all have issued fatwas to fight the French and issued fatwas to even transfer Homs to Malik Faisal, and they pledge allegiance to Malik Faisal as a leader of Arabs. It's very interesting at that time that the Islamic agenda and the Arab agenda were one, and that throughout, with time, separation has been planted between them, all the way to a point where they actually started to clash with each other. But that's, I know, is a different subject from today. But the 1920 revolution is a very strong manifestation of the unification of the Islamic agenda and zeal and spirit with the Arab agenda, zeal, and spirit. Professor, unity and independence. Do you feel that the Arab world today have accomplished what they have revolted for in the early 20th century? Do you feel that these goals have been accomplished or they are still work in progress?
Well, it was a journey. They accomplished some important and very significant stages of advancement, and they failed at various degrees at others. Unity has never been the even possible to accomplish, because the Arab world is not one nation in the way the Arab nationalists would like to paint it. And that's why I believe what the plague or the major flaw in the process of or the work of Arab nationalists has been that they insisted on political unity, politicizing everything, and they forgot to assemble the conditions for such unity. I mean, if you look at the processes that succeeded the Europeans and other areas where you started seeing integration, you could really talk about economic integration, social integrations. You cannot really talk about Arab unity among countries where citizens cannot get a visa to visit one each other, where each country sees itself or is led by a dictatorship, where people have no saying in their self-rule and in their governance. If you look at the attempts at unity, who were the champions of those? Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt was one of the champions of Arab unity. Saddam Hussein, Hafez al-Assad. And if you look at each one of them, they were all basically power-hungry maniacs. Each of them really looked at Arab unity as the Arab unity under their own flag. And when there was a case where you could see some unity, look at the experience of the United Arab Republic between Syria and Egypt. The Syrians who went and convinced Abdel Nasser to unite with them later on had to go to Cairo and cancel that unity because they found nothing in it for them. They were basically subjugated and swallowed by Egypt, and they did not find anything of them left in that unity. Look at the unification of Yemen, even though it is one country and one people. The South, until today, they see that, or they would claim that they never got anything from their unity with the North under Ali Abdullah Saleh. Iraq and Syria, they were ruled by the same Ba'ath party. And they were probably the two Arab countries that were the most, that were not on good terms with each other. And during the Iraq-Iran war, Hafez al-Assad supported Iran, and Saddam Hussein was fighting against Iran with some of the other Arabs. I think what they did is they put the horse before the cart. They wanted, or their ambition was above their capabilities and above their means. And also they didn't go about it the right way. They did not integrate their societies. How could you accomplish a unity between Somalia and Saudi Arabia unless you bring these people into some level? And we saw even in more advanced societies this disparity and this discrepancies in economic standings between one country and another. You will see the richer country would see the others as burden on them, and that's actually what caused the Brexit, for example. The British found that they were really being trampled on by the rest of the Europeans, and they were taken advantage of. And one little populist movement ended up getting Britain out of the European Union. So imagine, and there was a very decent level of homogeneity among all of the members of the European Union. But the Arab world, I mean, the differences are beyond imagination. How could you really think about political unity before assembling the conditions, economic, social, and cultural conditions, where you could finally make that political unity. Even countries that are close to one another. Look at the experience of the Gulf Cooperation Council. These are all rich oil countries. All of them are sheikdoms. All of them come from similar tribes. They are similar, as close to homogeneous as you can get. Yet they could not really accomplish a true cooperation council in the way, because it is every one of them sees itself as a leader of the group rather than a member of a team. And ultimately, all of them couldn't stand Saudi's relentless attempts to encroach upon each one's space and then to swallow them as the big sister. So trust is missing, and that missing of trust, they could not really accomplish even small accomplishable feats like united currency or true social integration. You can't. Arab states are still tribes, not states, and they are still led and ruled by the whim of one dictator rather than really by institutions and by ideas. And that is why I think we see that's the failure. People like to throw it on the colonization, and the colonization is, of course, responsible for a lot of the problems and the social and political ills in the Arab world, but also the materials that we have been working with as Arabs peoples are not yet ready to move to the next stage of the political and economic stage that would put the Arabs in their deserved position on the world theater.
Thank you, Doctor. As we come to the end of our program, definitely, Doctor, that the subject of Pan-Arabism has probably expired its time. Nevertheless, the talk of unity does not necessarily have to be tied into Pan-Arabism, nor does it have to be tied to any sense of ethnic identity. It is more, and I think I've heard you say that in one of your lectures, is that it is more tied to the civil and economical benefits of the people. You remember Dr. Alawi in one of his late interviews, as he's now serving as the finance minister of Iraq and the deputy minister, correct? He continues
Yes.
to serve on that position, and he was interviewed under that capacity, and he was telling the interviewer that the region does not really have the elements of an economic success without some sort of coordination and cooperation with each other. So there are elements, if not for the sake of the aspiration for a united identity, at least for an aspiration of a better life and economy and cooperation for the better welfare of the people. We still aspire to some sort of confederation or some sort of coordination between the Arab countries, whose people have in themselves have a feeling of unity and closeness to each other under this cultural identity of the Arab identity. Professor or Dr. Abbas, the 1920 revolution has a lot of scenes in it of great heroism and great patriotism, and so many stories within the pages of this revolution. If you were asked by a young Arab student or Iraqi student, why should I study the 1920 revolution? What should I learn from it? What would be your answer?
Well, as you said, it is a good moment in Iraqi history. For once, Iraqis forgot their ethno-sectarian differences and acted as co-patriots, as Iraqis. They did not look at the other on the basis of their ethnicity or their sect. And this was a moment that should have been cultivated by the Iraqis and built on. There is also, I think, the level of honor that was and ethics of war. The way they treated the British prisoners of war. Clearly, and by British reports, that they were well treated. They did not act with them as, in a way, as brutes and people who used inhumane ways. In fact, the treatment of the prisoners were conducted under the guidance that was sent in a form of a fatwa from Sheikh al-Sharia al-Asfahani, the marja of the time. And they were well fed, they were well taken care of, and they assigned people to maintain their comfort. While the Iraqi prisoners of war and under the British, the tribal men who fell in British hands, did not receive such a treatment. The British were brutal. They executed those that fell in their hands. There was no sense of, or those who were captured and as leaders, they sent them in exile in dreadful places like Hinjam and other islands near India or in the near Hermes. So in fact, in the ethics of war, I argue in my book that the revolutionaries were better than the British, who were in fact trying to use the claim that they were the civilized nation, that they were civilizing the rest of the world, and that it was, that they were bringing all of these goods to these nations they conquered. But in fact, they were ethically inferior. And that's very important. I think also that the revolution, with all of the sacrifices that took place, the people who sacrificed everything, and remember, the revolution was self-financed. They didn't receive any help from anywhere. People who participated, they bought their weapons and they gave everything, including the food they stored for their families. They gave it to the revolutionaries, but they got nothing out of the revolution. In fact, the government that was formed and all of the government positions went to other people. The revolutionaries were marginalized and excluded from the new state that was established. Yet they did not complain. They continued to support the monarchy despite the fact that they were marginalized and left out. And I think, that's why I believe that it was amazingly important to study those political attitudes among those who fought the revolution. And even though they were disappointed with the outcome of the revolution for them personally, they were satisfied. If you read their memoirs, you see that they were satisfied with the way the nation was going, even though they personally did not benefit. And these are lessons in self-sacrifice and also in lack of selfishness, if you were to put it that way, thinking for the general good rather than the narrow interest, which is, all of these are lessons that the current political leaders and also the current population of Iraq can learn from.
The list of lessons is such a long and important list that is this must be something that every Arab should study and realize in history. It's one of the great moments of our modern history. And your book, Dr. Abbas, in English, is a great resource for our youth to get educated about this subject. Thank you very much for being with us today on the Arab identity. I've always wanted you to be on this show, and I found the right episode for you, and hopefully we will have you in more episodes. Thank you for everything that you do, and for our listeners, thank you for following this episode. It will be available on YouTube and Facebook on all our pages. Also, it will be available on podcast. And have
Thank you
a great
for
evening.
having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Doctor, and have a great evening.
All the best. Good luck to everyone.